Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Ian McPherson. I'm with the Strategy, Policy and Performance team of the GPE Secretariat based in the Washington office. I hope you can hear me. I'm not sure if you can see me as well. I'm just going to introduce the webinar series, say a couple of very quick points on the content, and then pass over to our presenters. So I want to extend a very warm welcome to everybody. The first point I would like to say is to ask everyone to remain muted. We've had 130 people register for the webinar, and in order that we can have as clear a session as possible, please do keep your microphones on muted to avoid any background noise. So to say a very warm welcome to the webinar on civil society engagement in the Global Partnership for Education, Social Accountability and Advocacy for Results. Two quick points on the webinar series. We launched this in 2016, last year, in response to a demand expressed by our partners, primarily our developing country partners, for additional opportunities to drive knowledge and good practice exchange across the partnership. The webinar series is monthly and aims to foster and drive knowledge exchange and sharing of good practices across and through the global partnership, supporting the realization of its strategic goals, as well as, of course, national and regional and global objectives. The webinar forms part of a suite of knowledge and good practice tools and instruments that GPE provides to amplify its work and the work of its partners in an effort to strengthen the implementation of SDG 4 and showcase innovations and good practices taking place at country and global levels. CSEF webinar today is taking place at a very opportune moment for global education, with 2017 proving to be a very critical year as the world increasingly focuses on education, its centrality to achieving all of the SDG goals, and how the sector is to be financed. Combined with the efforts of partners in the CSO community, 2017 has the potential to be a watershed year for global education financing. And in this regard, the webinar will also touch upon efforts being made at national level through the CSEF to step up advocacy efforts to improve education financing, both in terms of efficiency and making the case for the need for increased investment, both domestic and external. I would again like everyone to remind everyone, please, to keep your microphones muted. I would also request that you turn off your cameras unless you are one of the presenters today, to ensure the best internet connection that we can have. We are truly spread across the globe today. If you do have any connection problems, please write about the technical problem in the WebEx chat room, or email the webinar account, which is webinars@globalpartnership.org. I would also like to inform you that this session is being recorded. And for those who are connected to WebEx by their computers, if you have any questions at all, in the discussion session that we will have after the presentations, please to send them through using the chat function. One quick point on CSEF and its importance to GPE. The Civil Society Education Fund is an initiative run by the Global Campaign for Education and financed by the Global Partnership for Education since 2009. CSEF plays a critical role in GPE's business model by supporting the meaningful inclusion of CSOs and CSO voice in education sector planning, implementation, and monitoring. And to tell us more about the content, I'm delighted to pass over to Louise Knight, who is with the Global Campaign for Education and is the CSEF Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Manager. She's based in Johannesburg and in South Africa. I believe as part of the preparatory materials, all of the presenter bios were sent out, so you should be able to access those. Before I hand over to Louise, I just want to indicate that there are a couple of blogs that have been written by colleagues in the Global Campaign for Education that can be found on the GPE website. And finally, to our presenters, if you can indicate to us when you need the slides to be moved forwards, as we are controlling this from the DC office. So without further ado, again, a very warm welcome and thank you for joining. And with that, I will pass over to Louise.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Indeed, Ian, civil society has we believe that civil society has a fundamental and critical role to play in the partnership. And in particular, through, as you mentioned, the Civil Society Education Fund, which has been predominantly funded by GPE since 2009. It's a very unique and ambitious global program, supporting citizen engagement in education sector planning, budgeting and monitoring throughout a number, rising to 63 GPE partner developing countries. Specifically, the Civil Society Education Campaign aims to support civil society organizations to come together to build diverse national coalitions and hold their governments to account for commitments to education. So as such, the program supports a coordinated civil society voice in holding governments accountable in education sector dialogue processes at the national level and on national budget allocations, tracking budgets, and advocating for spending better in education. So our goal today is threefold. The first goal is to build an understanding of the role of civil society organizations in the partnership, and particularly the role of the CSEF program and its partners through that. Secondly, we aim to explain in more detail the national, regional and global work carried out as part of the CSEF, or Civil Society Education Fund program, to ensure that all parts of the partnership have a more in-depth understanding in this program. And finally, we aim to provide space for feedback on the role of CSOs and specifically CSF in terms of engagement of CSOs in national policy processes, with the aim of improving, enhancing and deepening the effectiveness of CSO engagement. So, sorry, can you go back? I have not started my actual presentation I'm doing. Could you go back to slide 1, please? Thank you. It is my great pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce our distinguished presenters today. Apart from myself, we have 3 presenters, and I'd like to just briefly introduce those, all women, before continuing with my presentation. The first, after I've shared with you a bit of information on GCE and the CSEF program, is Solange Napoe Akpo. Solange is based in Lome in the African Network Campaign for Education for All program office. She is the capacity building manager of ANSEFA, and she's going to be speaking to us today briefly about how ANSEFA is structured, particularly within the CSEF program, and will place focus on change, which has been influenced by advocacy, examples of practice and results at the national level in the African context. We're then going to hear from Kathleen Sekwao. She is the coordinator of the Tanzania Education Network, which is also known as Mtandao wa Elimu Tanzania, excuse my pronunciation there, otherwise known as TENMET. Kathleen today will be presenting information on her country's most significant policy successes, which have been influenced through the support of CSEF. And then we will hear from Cecilia Soriano, also known as Tia. Tia is the Programs and Operations Coordinator for the Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education, known to many listeners here as ASPE. She's going to talk about the ASPE regional structure, particularly in the context of CSEF, and also present case studies of good practice and results at the national level in her context. So we will be hearing from them, but before we do, let me please go on to share with you an overview of the GCE, particularly its global role within the CSEF program. So now we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. CSEF. So the Civil Society Education Fund is rooted in the belief and vision that civil society is not only fundamental but also critical to holding governments to account for national and international goals, and that a well-informed and active civil society is critical to ensuring development, implementation and monitoring of education plans and policies. So CSEF plays an important role in bringing together a wide range of citizens' voices in a coordinated manner, not only their voices but also their perspectives, including those not normally heard, the most marginalized in policy-making processes. So there is a strong focus on engagement in local education groups as well as other government-led processes, but equally on building voice and public advocacy where necessary in a particular context. Just like as Ian had introduced, the Global Campaign for Education is the management agency for the CSEF program, but we work together with actually 8 regional agencies. I have 4 on the slide here, but the 4 that are shown on the slide, the Africa Network Campaign on Education for All, the Arab Campaign on Education for All, ASBE that I mentioned, and CLADE is the Latin American Coalition for the Right to Education, obviously in the Latin American context. These structures support us on a programmatic level, but we also work with 4 agencies, that is IBIS Oxfam in Africa, Education International in the Asia context, who am I missing? We work on the in Middle East, and there is one more that I seem to be missing. These are agencies that work on the financial aspects, but I will speak to that a little bit more just now. But GC itself, it's important to note, is a much broader movement, of course, than CSEF itself. Although we are working through CSEF, through the support of GPE, we're working currently with 64 national coalition members. The Global Campaign for Education itself is a much broader movement, with about 5,000 organizations engaged in the GCE processes and movement across over 100 countries. We actually have national coalitions in 85 countries, but of those that includes also coalitions in Europe and North America, which are primarily focused on solidarity rather than domestic issues. It's also important to note that many leading INGOs are global members of GCE, including ActionAid, CBM, Education International, one can go on, Global March Against Child Labour, IDE, IBIS, Light for the World, Oxfam International, Plan International, Results, Save the Children's Site Savers, VSO, and many others. And I think that we do have some of our listeners are, as I've seen from the list, are representing many of those organizations that I've just mentioned. So we can go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. The next slide will be bringing up a map of, it doesn't seem to be coming. Do you want me to move to sharing on my screen?
No.
No, it's
okay. Maybe it's showing for others. It's not showing on my screen. So the next slide should be a map of a sort of global map. Thank you. And this is a representation that you're seeing here of how CSEF is spread or engaged around the world through national coalitions. In current phase, CSEF, as Ian mentioned, started implementation in 2009, and that was phase 1. We're now in phase 3, which covers 2016 to 2018. And in this phase, we are engaging with partners, national partners in 63 countries. I don't know how clearly you can see the screen there, but I know everyone has had the PowerPoint shared with them, and the countries that are highlighted in bold text are those which are operating in fragile states, as determined by the definition of GPE. And that is 23 operating in fragile states, which are affected, or countries affected by conflict. And that's about 42% of the coalitions currently funded either directly or through regional support through the CSEF program. So what else you see on this map here are a couple of case examples of practice where policy has been influenced, education policy has been influenced, and I'll leave you to read those in your own time when you have an opportunity from the PowerPoint that has been shared for you. But I just want to also share that CSEF is working to build and strengthen national education coalitions in these countries that are highlighted, particularly in the orange color on your screen. And coalitions are made up of a large number of organizations, from community-based organizations, disability groups, youth, teachers' unions, and parent-teacher associations, and so forth. And in fact, it's one of our key areas of monitoring and measurement is looking at the representativity and inclusiveness of coalitions to ensure that they represent the voice of civil society in their education advocacy work. So apart from building coalitions, the program supports the promotion and awareness of education rights and policies linked to realities. It supports mobilizing organizations and citizens to engage and challenge local governments when their rights are not delivered, and represents views in official policy spaces. And it is our belief and our documented evidence that this helps to overcome some of the very well documented barriers to the realization of quality education. Those that many of us know, such as the lack of political will, weak policy frameworks, planning which doesn't respond to the realities of low-income families or the needs of excluded or marginalized populations, poor resource mobilization, a misallocation or misuse of funds. So sometimes this involves coalitions being a mouthpiece for the marginalized or the excluded, and also publicly and challenging government actions through citizen mobilization. And at other times it requires bringing citizen-led evidence or robust data to policy discussion, which I will speak a little bit more to just now. Next slide, please. The next slide, when it comes up on your screen, it's not showing on mine just yet, is an infographic which I won't speak to in great detail, but it does speak in numbers to the impressive growth since 2009 of the CSEF program. And obviously we're not only concerned about measuring numbers, but sometimes these speak give us a lot of extra information. So in 2009, there were 33, when the first phase of CSEF, there were 33 national coalitions part of the CSEF program. And by the end of 2015, it's risen to 54. And as I mentioned, we are now engaging with 63 coalitions in this 2016 to 18 phase. The membership of these coalitions was representing 1,129 organizations back in 2009. And by mid-2016, this growth had risen to 4,335. That's member organizations of coalitions. And these include grassroots organizations and youth-led organizations, parents and teachers associations, as well as women-led organizations. I think it's important for us to recognize as well that as much as we are tracking the extent of the membership of coalitions, we must recognize that sometimes some coalitions reach a ceiling of CSOs that are simply existing in the country, depending on the country context. So while we are looking at the growth, we do sometimes reach a ceiling and we can't expect these numbers to continuously be going up year on year across all countries. Nonetheless, through the monitoring processes that we have engaged in, we have seen incredible growth, and that includes not only the membership but also the extent of the reach of the coalitions within countries through subnational chapters. Since the beginning of 2009, since the beginning of CSEF, we've seen the growth of subnational chapters as reaching out to the more rural and marginalized sections of countries, rising from under a half to nearly 2/3 over the course of the program. So while this shows a story of a growing movement supported through the CSEF program, we still remain focused that one of the primary aims of the program is to facilitate engagement in sector processes, especially leg processes, and generating citizen-led evidence to drive forward citizen action. And we've seen a lot of impressive growth since 2009 in the area of evidence gathering and data usage in policy influencing processes. And I think we're going to hear some nice examples of that from our other presenters in the course of today's webinar. But just to give one example, in countries where there is a known active local education group or a equivalent mechanism to a leg, 86% of coalitions have been engaging in these processes at the last count, and in those processes using the evidence and data that they have been either gathering or analysing themselves if it's secondary source data to engage in those political dialogue and education sector tracking, implementation tracking processes and programs. So I'd like to move to the next slide, please. I think one of the unique features which my co-presenters will also highlight in their talks is that CSEF is a multi-layered approach. So it's working through the local to the national to the regional and global agenda, up and back down again. So this can mean engagement in social accountability processes through things like school audits, tracking budgets, etc., from the local level right up to the global, and whilst taking a global approach for research that is and commitments that are made globally back into the local level dialogue. For example, SDG 4, particularly in recent years, or if we take the case of Africa, the AU level in the region, coalitions are engaging in those processes either at national or regional, through regional structures, and making the link, from regional to global. We also have a number of coalitions, or most coalitions, are carrying out social accountability activities through, for example, engagement in governance structures like the CSO2 board engagement processes. Next slide, please. It's coming a bit slower, so I should just carry on. Okay. So, before I pass over to our speakers, what is the role of the Global Campaign for Education in the CSEF program? It is mainly around, we are the grant agent for the management and coordination of the CSEF program, which includes consistent liaison with GPE, coordinating strategic planning, managing monitoring, evaluation and learning, and quality control and reporting, management of grants at the regional level, and coordination of the overall program, and as well as support to ensure consistent quality of implementation across the regions, and communicating with implementing partners about program deadlines and requirements, etc., and working with regional entities in each region to ensure smooth implementation and support and also around issues of troubleshooting. The global GCE also fulfills the role of program coordination and support through the facilitation of national and global linkages, capacity support and learning. And this includes a coordination and liaison with the International Partners Group, which is a technical advisory structure made up of, comprising mostly INGO partners. Again, some of whom may well be listening to, sitting with us during this webinar. Part of the coordination and support function that GCE fulfills is the production and dissemination of relevant tools, such as advocacy tools, and production and sharing of information and good practice examples, as well as the creation of platforms for exchange. We also operate dialogues such as the one we are engaged in now. And one of the largest challenges we have with that is that GCE and its partners operates across 5 languages. So of course, not only can it be costly at times, but it does add layers of complexity as much as richness. We also, the GCE also has the function of grant and program oversight. One of the structures of the CSEF program, the highest decision-making structure, is the Global Oversight Committee. And these have specific functions made up of some of the board members of the GCE who provide as I said, an ultimate decision-making where necessary. And they're it helps to separate the grant management from other functions of GCE within the management of the CSEF program. So I'd like to now hand ourselves over. Thank you very much. You can take us to the last slide. Brings me to the last slide, and thank you very much for your attention. I'm sure some of you may have some questions, but please be sure to send your questions, including your name and institution, through the chat room facility, and we're going to address them during the question and answer session. But for now, I'd like to hand over to our colleague Solange, who is in Lomé. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruiz. Actually, I am in Accra. Okay, so it is now my pleasure to present to you 4 case studies from Africa. But before doing so, I will do a brief presentation on ANTEFA and CSEF work in Africa. Africa is a regional network of civil society education coalitions present in 37 countries. This is just an outline of the presentation. So, like I said, I will present 4 case studies, but a brief on ANTEFA and CSEF. So, ANTEFA is a regional network of civil society education coalitions present in 37 countries and member of the Global Campaign for Education. Like Louis said, CSEF started back in 2009, and since then, ANTEFA has been hosting the regional secretariat of the project in Africa and coordinated in 2016 implementation of the project in 28 countries. This represents almost half of the total countries supported by CSEF. Next slide, please. In addition to the regional secretariat, we also have the Regional Financial Management Agency appointed for the period 2016-2018, which is Oxfam IBIS. There is also a regional funding committee of 8 members that allocate the funds based on proposals submitted by the coalitions. But we must recognize that coalitions in Africa are at various stages of maturity and also policy engagement. Yes. The diversity is also notable around, sorry, could you go back to the previous slide? So the diversity is also notable around languages. CSEF operates in 3 languages, being English, French, and Portuguese. So I want to start by presenting the case study of Zimbabwe. The coalition in Zimbabwe is called ECCCE, Education Coalition in Zimbabwe, and they are trying to enhance grassroots participation in education policy processes. Next slide. Yes. Through its participation in the education coordination group meetings and joint monitoring visit, the coalition advocated for the inclusion of all stakeholders up to grassroots level in the education sector strategic plan and GPE processes, as well as school governance processes. Next slide. As a result of their advocacy, the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education Head Office instructed provincial education directors in all the 10 provinces of the country to work with the ECCCE members at grassroots level. They were then able to participate in the development of the district operational plans of the ministry and influence the content to take up issues that are of concern of them. Next slide, please. Through these actions, ECCCE gained increased credibility. ECCCE was then selected to be part of the Education Strategic Sector Plan Technical Working Group and Drafting Committee. They were able to participate in the development of the National Operation Plan and also facilitated participation of 47 CSOs operating at grassroots level. They participated also in the GPE joint monitoring visit at both national and subnational level. In a total of 19 districts, there were joint monitoring by the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education staff and ECCCE grassroots members in 2016. Next slide. I want then to move to Senegal, where the coalition is called COSIDEP, and I want to share briefly their strategy to engage in the implementation of the SDG 4. In December 2016, the Senegalese coalition, COSIDEP, brought together key actors and education stakeholders with the objective of reaching a common understanding on SDG 4. A reference document on key terms and concepts related to the education and SDG was drafted and is used actually as basis of interventions of civil society education actors in the country. Next slide. They also drafted during this workshop tools and instruments to monitor the implementation of SDG 4. And these tools are meant to be used by coalition representatives in the region. You must notice that COSIDEP is one of those coalitions who cover the total country. They are present in all the regions, and they have very vibrant civil society actors. They drafted campaign messages, and those will be used to help actors in their advocacy effort. And finally, they organized a popular hike with celebrities, credible and recognized voices to sensitize community. Next slide. In this next slide, you will see this is a picture announcing the hike on December 10, 2016. And the second picture is about SDG 4 implementation with celebrities showing their engagement to support implementation of SDG 4. Next slide. Now we are going to Cape Verde, not very far from Senegal, where the focus of the coalition advocacy is about inclusive education and focusing more on early childhood care and education. The coalition has been advocating so that all children in the country can access preschool. To achieve that, they embarked on a research to gather evidence. With the results of the outcome of the research, they organized a workshop on gender equity in preschool education with the participation of a former member of the National Assembly. We must notice that in Cape Verde, 15% of children do not attend preschool education, especially in rural areas, and more than 90% of teachers do not have specific training for preschool education. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so the coalition organized marches, campaigns, and TV spots with the participation of the Minister of Education, the chairperson of the National Human Rights Committee, the chairperson of the NGO platform, and former First Lady of Cape Verde, including musicians, parents, and journalists. They hold working meeting with the Ministry of Education staff to present their input into the preschool law. Next slide. All this mobilization and media engagement produced results. There was a government commitment to include preschool education in the national education system and make it available to all children in the country during the mandate 2016-2020. There was also a commitment to support poor children and families paying preschool education fees. The work of the coalition was recognized by the government at local and national level. Next slide. Yes, on those two pictures, we are seeing a march organized by the coalition members and youth during Global Action Week with a motto, child education is the first step for inclusion. And on the other image, this is a working meeting on preschool education law review in the Ministry of Education with their officers. Next slide. Finally, the last case is about education in emergency in Cameroon. In the northern part of Cameroon, there is an emergency situation due to the Boko Haram attack on school, and these are impacting negatively on access and retentions in school. CSEF, which is the Coalition Education for All network, embarked on a campaign with the aim to make the government put education in emergency in the policy and strategic document of the ministry. In 2015, CSEF did a research to collect evidence for their advocacy effort. Next. They organized a national forum on the issue of education in emergency, where government and all partners presented their intervention on the different sites receiving refugees and internally displaced people. In 2016, CSEF and other CSOs adopted the civil society position on education in emergency and organized lobbying meetings with MPs, Member of Parliament. As a result, a focal point on education in emergency was appointed by the Ministry of Basic Education, who is now in charge of coordinating government interventions directed to the refugees and the IDPs. 17 schools, 2 preschool, 1 high school, and 2 literacy centers were established by the government in the refugee camp of Minawao, receiving mostly people coming from Nigeria. In conclusion, next, the CSEF program has helped over the years CSOs in Africa to engage at various levels in the policy spaces to represent the voices of the grassroots and communities with the ultimate objective to ensuring more equity, inclusion, and enhanced and better financing of the education sector. And CEFA and CSOs in Africa are grateful to GPE for this support. Thank you. I'm handing over to Louise.
Thank you very much, Solange. Again, I'll just ask if you do have questions that you'd like to share with Solange, then please do send them through on the chat facility. And just in the interest of time, I will take us open the floor now for Kathleen Sekwa of TenMet to share with us successful stories from the Tanzania context. Thank you, Kathleen.
We might have to flip the order because there's no one in the dark office, so we might have to move to Taya.
Yeah, let's.
Do you want? Is the audio on? Mm-hmm. Hello, colleagues. It's Ian in the DC office. It seems that we can't reach Kathleen in the Dar es Salaam office, so I suggest that we move straight to Taya's presentation, please. Taya, are you connected?
Taya, Cecilia, are you with us? We could just see Kathleen ourselves just now, Ian and colleagues at GPE. I'm not sure. We had her on, seeing her visuals on video just now. I think Taya is coming through now. Taya, can you hear us? Can you see us? If you're ready, can you unmute and start for us?
Okay. Hi. Hello, good evening, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello?
Please start. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Now from Asia Pacific, I'm pleased to share with you some stories, particularly 2 country cases from Southeast Asia and South Asia, showcasing or sharing civil society's efforts in ensuring government's accountability in guaranteeing quality and inclusive public education. We will look at the lessons from Cambodia, and then later on lessons from Nepal, and then I will share some work that we are doing within ASBE. But just a short historical background to give you to show you that there has been a change in civil society participation for the past 15 years in the region. So way back in the early years of 2000, after the Dakar Declaration, ASBE conducted a citizens-led education watch with only 10 countries, 10 countries from the subregions of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and South Pacific. By doing this education watch, we were able to collect data on the ground, putting forward rigorous analysis of data education, and disseminating the messages clearly. We were able to collectively change the government's misconception that civil society or NGOs are all noise without clear recommendations, and the misconception of government that civil society is a nuisance that only delay the processes of decision-making in education. Now, more than 15 years after those initiatives, there are now 21 countries in Asia Pacific where national education networks or civil society are engaging their governments. 19 of them are part of the CSEF program. Admittedly, some are more advanced than the others. A few countries such as Samoa, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan are still in the stage of building their network and forging strong unity on the education agenda. But it's a long process that we have learned all throughout doing education advocacy in Asia Pacific. And we know that there are a lot of lessons from which we can gather lessons for other countries to replicate or to contextualize their own. Okay. Well, we have different dynamics and levels of engagements in demanding accountability. Yeah, okay, thank you for, but in education, what is clear is that civil society has gained the credibility in many countries in the education sector. So I'm going to share, as earlier mentioned, I'm going to share two instances. What you are seeing in your screen now is the experience from Cambodia, NGO Education Partnership Cambodia. NGO Education Partnership, or NEP Cambodia, was established in 2002. Currently, it has 140 organizations doing education advocacy across 25 provinces. It is recognized by the Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports as the official representative of civil society and is always part of the National Education Policy dialogues. Every year, NEP Cambodia is expected or even required to present a CSO report on education from which analysis and recommendations are considered by the government in its education sector review and planning. With this recognition and its expansive reach to both NGOs and grassroots organizations, NEP Cambodia was able to integrate local knowledge and needs and in ensuring that government's policy and planning reflect the realities on the ground and that the voices of marginalized groups are factored in the education planning. For example, towards localization of SDG 4 in Cambodia, NEP Cambodia collected the citizens' issues and recommendations, particularly looking at local education targets, local indicators and strategies, and these have been presented to government to influence the National Localization Plan for Education 2030. NEP Cambodia also supports effective policy implementation by building subnational ownership and monitoring progress and policy commitments. One example is NEP Cambodia's research on teaching hours. The research are 27% lower than the official norm due to additional official holidays, teacher absenteeism due to poor health and working conditions, as well as lessened contact teaching days. As a result of this research, NEP is now working with the Primary Education Department to conduct a baseline assessment of the full-day teaching, which is being piloted by the government. The government has also started looking into the recommendations of that research, particularly in addressing teacher shortage, recruitment and professionalization of teachers, as well as innovative pedagogies to augment contact time with learners and to work with parents and local organizations to monitor policy implementation. Now, at this point, let me share with you. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, what I'm showing here is the architecture or education architecture in Cambodia. But what I would just like to focus on is that Cambodia's participation has been institutionalized in the country, so much so that it is part of the National Education Sector Working Group, and its members are also part of the Provincial Education Sector Working Group, and there is this dynamics from the local to the national, and the national also feeding information to the local level. NEP is also part of the National Joint Technical Working Group, which is in charge of capacity building on education. Its members in the 25 provinces are members also of the Provincial Joint Technical Working Group. So it is important to note that through the work of NEP Cambodia, The civil society participation is not a one-off, it is not projectized, but it is institutionalized in the education architecture in the country. And the next slide also shows that NEP Cambodia is part of several working groups, thematic working groups, such as on ECCE, primary subsector working group, non-formal education subsector group, and working group on education and disability, which was recently added by the government. These working groups looked at not only policies, but programs, effective programs that will ensure quality, access to quality and inclusive education in the country. Thank you. So can we go to the next slide? And I would like to share the experience of the National Campaign for Education, or NCE Nepal. NCE Nepal was formed in 2003. It started with less than 20 members, and now it has 286 members with 19 district coalitions, which is considered the chapter for them. And it is also recognized by the government and participates regularly in government-led processes, such as in the recent school sector development plan meetings. And related to SSDP, it also sits in the 17 thematic working groups, as well as in the joint education sector annual and biannual review, education reviews and planning. NCE Nepal, very in the PowerPoint, are the key focus areas of NCE Nepal, such as SDG 4, education financing, also with focus on privatization of addressing privatization of education in the country. It also worked on the enactment of Education Act, or 8th Amendment. As we know, Nepal is in a transition, and it recently, in 2015, it was able to pass the Constitution of Nepal. It also worked with ASBE on using the UN human rights mechanisms in engaging the issues of privatization of education and negative impact on equity in education. And lastly, one of its focus is also on education accountability post-disaster. NCE Nepal has been very active, or an effective bridge between citizens and the government. In the SSDP, it was officially designated by the government to collect feedback on the draft SSDP from different grassroots communities in the 75 districts of Nepal. And also, by collecting this, NCE Nepal was able to gather a substantive amount of recommendations to the government, presented to the government, particularly on improving equity, quality, efficiency, governance, and management, and importantly, to promote resiliency of education sector. One significant evidence reflecting that the government owned the CSO recommendations is the acceptance of the concept of disaster resiliency in education and the inclusion of disaster risk reduction components in the SSDP as a separate cross-cutting issue. And this was a recent success of NCE Nepal. In constitution building, NCE Nepal contributed in enshrining education as the fundamental right of the Nepalese people. It provided the results of the survey of more than 50,000 stakeholders. And this survey was done through phase, also done by online mechanism, which was all collected and then submitted through a presentation of a citizens' charter. But as with any country, amidst the successes are the challenges. While the Nepal government expressed its commitment to invest more in education, it has been consistently decreasing the share of national budget to education since 2006. In 2006, the education budget in Nepal is 16% of the national budget, but in 2016, it is down to 11% of the national budget. This presents a very difficult challenge for NCE Nepal, because while it sits in the government dialogue and hearing about the government promises, and while it engages the government, it wants to remain critical of the gaps in education in Nepal. And so it was a sort of 1 foot in and 1 foot out framework for NCE Nepal. So what NCE Nepal did was use a periodic review by submitting a CSO report on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, emphasizing the impact of privatization of education on access and equity in education. NCE Nepal has been very successful. The concluding observations from the Universal Periodic Review and the recommendations made by the UN Convention on the Right of the Child were in line with the recommendations of NCE Nepal. In fact, they were taken in by the UNCRC. These recommendations include: 1, implementation of appropriate financing strategies to ensure free compulsory public education as envisioned in the Constitution, and 2nd, proper monitoring and regulation of private schools. These recommendations were again discussed at the country level after the meeting in Geneva, and the government has pledged to support NCE Nepal's recommendations, looking into the budgets and looking also at implementation strategies. So now I come to sharing a few of I'm going to focus on a few capacity building that ASBE has been doing with coalitions in Asia Pacific. Next slide please. ASBE is currently doing capacity support and mentoring around 4 areas. These are a few that I have picked up, but there are a lot more, but I would like to focus on 4 capacity building and mentoring. 1 is capacity building and trainings, looking at policy analysis, looking at budget tracking, gender mainstreaming, and other issues that are important or demanded by the national education coalitions. We also invite some experts coming from different countries, and we also provide exchanges among the national education coalitions. For example, in Central Asia, we invited Mongolia to give to share their experiences in advocacy. And in Afghanistan, we had a regional meeting with composed of Nepal, India, and they presented also their experiences to Afghanistan and Central Asia. So capacity building is not only from ASBE, but also from the coalitions themselves. We also do accompaniment of education coalitions in meetings with government and education stakeholders, most especially at the regional level. We have a lot of, we accompany, but in fact, we negotiate for spaces and negotiated slots for civil society and National Education Coalition in the regional meetings in UNESCO Bangkok, making sure that the voices of the countries are heard at these regional processes. We support coalitions in navigating policy processes such as regional and sub-regional processes, like in the SARC Framework for Action for Education 2030. There was a meeting in Kathmandu. We made sure that NCE Nepal was there, negotiating with UNESCO Delhi as well. Importantly, we facilitate knowledge not visible or not available at the country level. In our experience, they are available at the regional level. And since ASBE has access to the regional, since ASBE is sitting at the thematic working group on Education 2030, it has access to information that is otherwise not available at the country level. So this was the exchange of knowledge from the regional to the national, and bringing national knowledge to the regional mechanism policy spaces is one of the role of ASBE. So I stop here. I think the next slide also covers this, but just to end that a big concern in the region now, based on the strategic planning that we had last November, is the concern about the political realities in Asia Pacific. There is a trend towards shrinking democratic spaces. And as we know, advocacy is very much affected by political space made available by the government. So National Education Coalition recognized that we need to be vigilant in preserving democracy and ensuring people's participation. And for this to happen, we need to work with human rights groups, we need to work with other sectors. And by ensuring people's participation, only then can we continue and build on the gains that we had in ensuring social accountability and the right to education. Thank you very much.
Tia, thank you very much for that. Again, if any of the audience would like to share questions, please feel free to do so, and we will address them in the Q&A session. I hope that we can now.
Louise, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I apologize for that. Tia, thank you very much for that. And we welcome again any questions to be shared through the chat facility. I would like us to move quickly to Kathleen to allow time for discussion. Kathleen, are you able to join us now? Kathleen, could you unmute and speak to us?
Louise, we cannot see Kathleen, regrettably, and I suggest that we move through to the discussion now, which is good in one way, but obviously regrettable that we haven't been able to connect Kathleen. So let's move into the discussion part of the webinar, and if Kathleen appears, maybe we'll ask her just to give a few very short, brief inputs rather than her full presentation.
Okay, thanks, Ian. It's a shame because we have visuals of Kathleen, but clearly the sound is broken. So can I just confirm, Ian, that because we were a bit broken there, that we can move into the Q&A session now?
Yes, please, Louise. Let's move to the Q&A.
Doesn't always come off. Why is it not disconnecting? Let me get rid of that.
Louise?
Yes.
If you can,
sorry.
Let's move
we had a broken connection this side. I've had to turn my video off. I apologize for that. Okay, thank you very much. I have seen a number of questions coming through from our listeners, from participants, and particularly from within actually the CSEF program. Many of them are directed concerning the African context, which I would like to ask our colleague Solange to try to address. We have a query on two questions around the role of coalitions in influencing particular aspects of policy within the context, first of all, of Ghana, and secondly of Senegal. So Solange, perhaps you can pick up these ones. In the context of Ghana, as you probably know, the President of Ghana recently gave a State of Union address where he introduced free education. And one of our participants would like to know what is the progress of the coalition or CSEF in influencing minimum standards in learning infrastructure in the Ghana context, for example, moving away from situations of learning under trees. That is question number one. And then Solange, in the Senegalese context, as we know, the SDG 4 has a series of targets, and the question is that is posed to us is whether the Senegal coalition is specifically focused on any particular targets for government action in the current period. So if I can hand those two questions to you, Solange, and give me an opportunity to pick up if another one has come in that time.
Thank you, Louise, for this question. I will start with the Ghana situation. where the president recently declared free secondary education in Ghana. I think this is a good move, which is welcomed by civil society coalition, but other actors also. But we can also say that Ghana is one of the countries who has been investing massively to support education and even providing capitation grant for children to be really to enjoy their right to free education. And this has been observed for the primary education. And if now we welcome the move to put this at the secondary level, education level, I think that it is welcome, but the coalition will also have a role to ensure that this is not just talk, but also put into action, and to ensure that in the rural areas of Ghana, where we still have those like how we call it, learning under trees, that this will be progressively phased out from the school environment. But Ghana, I think, is not the worst case. Let's say that the government is making effort. Civil society is vibrant and also following up and monitoring the government effort. Let's hope for the best, that it will continue like that. And Civil Society Education Fund has been supporting the Ghana Coalition to also engage in this sector dialogue. They are participating in most of the policy spaces. The space is open. It's not like in other countries. So I think that with this support, the coalition will take forward its advocacy work with the support of the Secretariat and also the Regional Financial Management Agency, so that the civil society can be really a watchdog of the government promises. Regarding Senegal, on the SDG 4 and the series of targets, the coalition in Senegal has some advocacy priorities around girls' education, around inclusive education, and also education financing. So in their engagement in the sector, they are focusing more on those aspects to ensure that girl children remain in school and that they perform and complete their primary and secondary education. With regard to the inclusive education aspect, which is also a focus of CSEF work, they have been ensuring that there is now a directorate working on inclusive education. They have drafted, with the support of partners, a tool so that teachers are trained on how to take charge of those children with special needs in the country. They have went ahead to even intervene in some schools so that they accommodate the space so that children with special needs can have access like any other. But those are just pilot actions that they are advocating for the government to take on so that it can be put on a higher scale. Civil society in its intervention can focus on small area, demonstrate results, and see how it is possible to improve the situation. And then we hope that with all those good initiatives in areas that maybe seem small, but we can demonstrate and advocate for the government to take it up so that all the children in the country can benefit from it. So in a nutshell, just to summarize, CSEF has focused on girls' education, inclusive education, but also engaging the government so that the budget allocated to education is well utilized, so that there is no that the maximum of the funds arrive in school for the support of the children.
Louise, sorry to cut across you. It's Ian again here. We see that Kathleen has now joined us, and it would be great to have an abridged input from Kathleen that still allows us a little bit of time for discussion. So forgive me for cutting across you, Louise, but just appealing to Kathleen, I don't think that we'll have time to go through your full presentation, but if you could give us a few highlights of TENMET's work in Tanzania, that would be very welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon for some people, good evening for some others. Do you hear me now? Is it okay?
Yes.
Yes, we're good, thank you.
Okay. I started by introducing my coalition, the Tanzania Education Network, Mtandao wa Elimu Tanzania in Swahili, and the acronym is TENMET. So I'll be using TENMET more often than the other names. As the name denotes, it's a network of civil society organizations, 181 of them, that are working in education in Tanzania. And it was founded in a workshop that was organized by UNESCO in 1999 in preparation for the Dakar Education Conference. TENMET envisages vibrant CSOs that promote equitable access to quality education. And the mission, of course, is in line with the vision to promote equitable access to quality education. How do we do that? By coordinating and strengthening education CSOs in Tanzania through capacity building, advocacy, research, networking, and coordination. So that those 4 areas also becomes our mandate: capacity building, networking, coordination, advocacy, and research. Today we just present 2 success stories among the many, but these are the recent ones and which we are celebrating on. Success story 1 is that we were able to reverse the government move of transferring teacher education management and the regulation system to another institution. Teacher education and training has always been under the Ministry of Education within the Directorate of Teacher Education. But in 2012, the ministry initiated the process of moving this function to the National Council for Technical Education. This was done, of course, without any research, without any consultation with the stakeholders. It was just like an underground move, and we were not aware of it until 2014, when the ministry started implementing this move. So we found out that the incompetent teacher trainees were applying for teacher training courses through the National Council for Technical Education. We all know that teaching is a profession and technician is a profession, and we believe that the two are not miscible at all. So what we did, what were the issues apart from just transferring these functions? They also made teacher training colleges to become autonomous, setting and marking their own exams, and also being self-reliant financially. This was like an abrupt move, and the teacher training colleges were not prepared for, so they also suffered. which means there was no national government subsidy to these institutions. So, which means they had to raise the fees, the tuition fees, from 150,000 Tanzanian shillings to 600,000 T shillings. This, of course, made a very drastic, that is, I didn't say next, but you are there. This may cause a very drastic decline in the enrollment of teacher trainees. For example, there's one college which normally has a capacity of 600 teacher trainees, but for that year they enrolled only 100. And another one which had a capacity of 1,500 enrolled only 300. So this again, all these moves were impacting negatively to the quality of education, because we have a deficit of teachers in schools. And this one is this move was going to make even a more serious decline of teachers. A new curriculum was developed by the National Council for Technical Education, but there was no training of the tutors, which again would impact negatively on the quality of education. On this move, teachers were to be awarded what they call technical awards, hence referred to as technicians, teachers being referred to as technicians of education. And if we were concerned that this move was going to kill the teaching profession as a profession. So what did we do? First, we did a bit of research about this. What do people say about this? How do people feel? What do the colleges think about this move? Out of that research, we prepared what we called a position paper, a position of tenement, talking against this move. And we held a stakeholders meeting, a broader spectrum stakeholders meeting. But unfortunately, we had invited the Minister of Education also to clarify on this move so that people know why, what really prompted them to make this move. But unfortunately, they did not attend. Next, we also presented our position paper to a National Teacher Education Curriculum Framework appraisal workshop, and this again provoked a lot of debate. We again also shared the position paper with members of Parliament, particularly the Social Services Committee of the Parliament. And they used the information also to argue against the move within the Parliament. We also shared the position paper and other documents with the current Minister of Education, and commented and agreed with our concern, because the move was made before she became the minister. So it didn't really take long. Immediately after consulting him, after 1 month, he reversed the move. And as we talk now, the mandate of teacher education management is within the Ministry of Education. What we believe, and there was a specific circular in 2016, circular number 5, to reverse this move. So what we believe is that there will be now increased number of teacher trainees in colleges. There will be improvement in the quality of education. And the teaching, do you hear me?
Yes,
and the teaching profession will be protected and also respected. Now the success story number 2
Kathleen, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's Ian at the DC office. 2 points. Could all colleagues please mute their microphones because we're getting a lot of interference. So please, if everyone mute their microphones. And secondly, Kathleen, with the greatest of respect, I'm going to ask you to keep your success story to just one. Rather than moving into the second, because we only have 10 minutes left for the webinar and we do have a lot of questions that have come in. So with sincere gratitude for sharing that story, we will have to end your inputs now and hand back to Louise to moderate just the last 7 minutes for the Q&A. And may I please ask colleagues to mute their microphones. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Since the people have the PowerPoint presentation, I'm sure they'll be able to read the second success story. Thank you.
Thank
you. Thank you very much, Kathleen, and we do apologise for cutting you off there, but as you said, everybody has an opportunity to look at the presentation that's been shared with them. Thank you, colleagues, for some interesting questions shared. I have got 2 questions particularly for which I'd like to direct towards our colleague Thea Cecilia at ASBE. So Thea, I hope you're able to hear these. There was a particular question about the interest in gender mainstreaming in the gender mainstreaming trainings that ASBE has conducted. Can I just ask colleagues to please mute their microphones? We're getting a lot of interference here. Thank you very much. Taylor, there's a question around the gender mainstreaming trainings undertaken by ASBE and whether you could just very briefly share the approach that has been adopted for those trainings, particularly around the key entry points that are emphasized during those trainings, because there are some colleagues who would like to learn lessons from that. Secondly, a second question for Taya as well is what lessons can we draw about, and I would invite our other colleagues to also. I'm also getting some more. Please mute your microphones, please. Not mine. Tara, another question is the lessons that can be drawn about conditions necessary for civil society success in improving accountability or transparency. And I think that we may invite other colleagues to also respond to that to provide a contextual nuance. So in the Africa or Asia context, perhaps you can consider that there. Let me leave it there, and we have 2 more questions to share once we've heard from those.
Okay, thank you very much, Luis. As for gender mainstreaming, ASBE has done a study on South Asia gender equality in education way back in 2010, and through this initiative, we were able to generate some tools that we are currently using, but also updating when we use this in the capacity building with the National Education Coalition. When we look at the gender mainstreaming, we address also how we are able to do policy advocacy that looks at gender equality in education, looking at infrastructure, curriculum, looking at financing, equity in gender, and also looking at governance. So there are some tools that we use, and not only for policy advocacy, also with National Education Coalition, we push them towards making their own organization also gender fair, gender responsive, ensuring that women, girls, as well as boys and men are given equal opportunity to participate in the decision making within the government, and that policies are in place to ensure the diverse needs of both men and female are addressed in the organization. So in a nutshell, ASBE has a lot of tools that we use. Recently, what we have done also in gender mainstreaming is to look at the SDG 4 and look at the local indicators for education, particularly looking at local gender indicators and how this can be shared or advocated to the government. As for the second question, what are the lessons learned in effective advocacy? I can only think at the moment of three, but very quickly. I think for civil society to be a strong force in social accountability, it has to have leadership and visibility. Leadership, not a few people, but leadership in terms of a command of diverse and broad-based constituency. This is very important, from the INGO to the NGOs to the grassroots organizations. And this leadership is translated into evidence-based advocacy as well. There are a lot of networks who have done evidence-based advocacy mainly through the help of their members and gathering of data from the different members. And lastly, the third point about effective advocacy is consistent engagement. For example, in budget advocacy, this is not a one-off initiative. You cannot do advocacy this year and then not do it next year. It's a continuing engagement with the Ministry of Education. So advocacy is continually engaging the government and the different agencies and decision makers in education and putting pressure every time, anywhere the decision makers are. So these are my two bits on the lessons learned in effective advocacy.
Thank you, Taya, and I'd like to share a couple more questions that have come through. One is directed at, if Solange could answer this, is for Africa, but we may find that Kathleen can add some further nuance to this. In the context of the recent Learning Generation report of the International Education Commission, Solange, which has indicated that by 2030, according to the report, 69% of the youth are not likely to master basic primary education skills in the African context. Are there any particular, are you able to share with us any particular work that coalitions and or UNCEFA are undertaking to try and avoid this predicted failure? That is one for you, Solange, to consider. While I have one here that I think is perhaps more, I'd like to direct this to Ian at GPE, if I may. On the map that I showed earlier on, where the contexts in which the CSEF coalitions are currently working, or CSEF supported coalitions, you will recall that some of the countries were bolded to show that they are working in fragile or conflict-affected contexts. And these we had highlighted as defined by GPE. We may have different definitions across the CSEF program, but these are as defined by GPE. And one of our audiences was a little bit concerned not to see Palestine, Yemen, or Somalia highlighted as countries classified as fragile or in conflict states. Perhaps you can speak particularly to the Yemen context, Ian. I think the Palestine, it's, in that case, it is clustered under World Bank and Gaza on the map, and just a correction that Somalia is actually bolded there. So perhaps you can just give us a bit of a GPE's understanding of the status of Yemen. It may well be that it's a printing error as well. So I'll pass those two questions, and then we have some questions around the accessibility to CSCF support, which I'll return to when we've heard those two responses.
Shall I start?
Yes, please, Solange.
Yes. I want to respond to the question about the African youth lacking skills. They say about 69% of the African youth are lacking the basic skills and could not enter in employment. And this is really a concern for the coalition, but also the leaders in Africa. And what I can say about the civil society is that most of the coalition are working on some aspect that we think can help us change the trend. First of all is the financing, education financing. If the education systems in Africa are well resources, they could help in bringing more children in the system and also give them the relevant education that they need. So the kind of financing that can be helpful for us is the domestic resource. This is why civil society in most of the countries are advocating for their government to increase the domestic part of their the financing going to education, not only relying on aid, on foreign resources, even if they are welcome. The second aspect is the content of the education that youth and children are getting in Africa. If the content is matching the needs of the continent so that the continent can develop, Africa cannot develop without a skilled human resource. And I think that this is now a clear concern from the African Union, and you can see it reflected in the continental education strategy of Africa, where there is an emphasis on skills for the youth, on employment. And I think that this is also linked to the third aspect I wanted to mention, which is the teachers, the kind of teachers we are having in school. Those that have the responsibility to educate this human resource that we need. This is why there is also an emphasis on teacher training, on teacher motivation. Teacher training at the beginning, but also in-service training, motivation and retention, so that the teacher service is not something that you do when you leave the university because you are looking for a job, waiting to find some better green pastures to move on to. For African countries to be able to retain teachers in the education system, they need to be motivated. So I think those three aspects, financing, relevance of the content of education, and qualified teachers are needed for the African youth to have the skills needed for the development of the countries and the continent in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solange. It's Ian here from GPE in Washington. Just very quickly on the question of Yemen. Yemen is one of GPE's fragile and conflict-affected states, so I would suggest perhaps that was a printing error in the map, and I would direct you to the Yemen page on the GPE website that provides details of the length of commitment of GPE to Yemen. It's been a partner since 2003, and there have been over $120 million allocated to support education sector planning in Yemen, of which about 56 million have been distributed so far. There are also a number of additional resources that describe GPE's work in fragile and conflict-affected states available on the website. I'm going to use the opportunity to regrettably have to close out our webinar. We're actually 4 minutes over our timeline. I want to thank Louise from the Global Campaign for Education, Solange from ANSEFA, Taya from ASBE and Kathleen from TenNet very much for your presentations and inputs. All of the participants who have listened in and sent through questions. If there are some remaining questions, please by all means do continue to send them through to the GPE webinar website. We will be continuing the dialogue through the blog function, and we will be sending out information on the recording of this to all of the participants who registered. I also just wanted to thank my colleagues here in the GPE office, particularly Umed Partov, who I think all of you have been in touch with for organising this, and also Victoria Egbatayo as well for putting this together. So with that, I thank you again. I'm sorry that we weren't able to have a little bit longer for the Q&A session, but I hope that you have found it interesting and informative. And we will look forward to continuing this discussion through the blog functions and outreach through the webinar mail list. So thank you very much.
And on behalf of GCE and our colleagues through the CSEF program, thanks to GPE for facilitating this webinar opportunity. And thank you to everybody for the questions. I'm very sorry that we were not able to get to all of them, and do hope that we can engage with them through the blog facility.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.